Without 9/11, there wouldn't have been a recession. The majority of recessions are over in about 12 months, the vast majority in fewer than 24. Economic expansions don't die of old age, they're murdered.
Hello and welcome to On the Right. I'm your host, Apoorv Agarwal. Today I'm extremely excited to welcome Tyler Goodspeed. He's a Chief Economist at ExxonMobil, holds a double PhD from Harvard and Cambridge. He's also an expert on financial crises and economic history and has a new book out called Recession: The Real Reasons Economies Shrink and What to Do About It. What makes Tyler truly remarkable is his ability to translate complex economic ideas into real-world insights. What are some of the unintuitive things you've learned about recession?
The conventional story of the 2001 recession is that was the dot-com recession. The decline in tech stock prices was just one of at least 4 shocks impacting the U.S. economy. There was also the People's Republic of China.
I know you speak a lot about this recession in the 1770s.
The cause of that recession, unambiguously, were pirates. Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, you had Calico Jack. It's interesting to reflect on that recession in the context of the Strait of Hormuz.
What happened in 2008?
If I asked you to name when the price of energy in the past century reached its all-time high, you might guess 1973 during the Arab oil embargo, or 1979-80 during the Iranian Revolution, or 1990 during the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. But the correct answer would actually be...
Tyler, thank you so much for joining us today.
Great to be with you, Apoorv.
So many timely topics you're an expert on, which I'm excited to talk about. Of course, your incredible book, Recession, where you've studied centuries of recessions and a lot of predictions for people to stay out of the market. So we'll talk about predicting recessions and what they look like. But the other very important topic I'm excited to chat about is the AI bubble. But before getting into all of that, what were some of the key points of inflection? How did this world of macroeconomics and energy kind of pull you in? And how did you earn the right to be where you are today?
Well, thank you for having me on, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. My professional trajectory has been very nonlinear, including just the academic route that I started out doing economic history and gradually migrated to more of a quantitative economic approach. And that's why I picked up the second PhD in economics from Cambridge while I was teaching at Oxford University over in the United Kingdom. And then in 2017, I had always wanted to spend some time in policy. It was only supposed to be for a year, yet a year turned into 2, that then turned into nearly 4. And I went back into academia after that, in academia for a few years before then entering the private sector at my current employer, ExxonMobil. Although I should specify that both the book and my remarks here are entirely in my personal capacity.
That's right, definitely. You studied economics and history, but in terms of energy, was that like a natural transition, or was that like an obvious outcome of the path you were on?
Great question. And no, I am not from an energy economics background. My expertise, my specialization within economics was in economic history and macroeconomics. Throughout my career, both in academia and in government and now in the private sector, I'm just constantly trying to learn. Learning almost by definition means going outside your comfort zone, pushing yourself. And so being at an energy company, really a technology company, because we are full of engineers, so it's been really fun and exciting to learn about the industry and to learn from my engineering colleagues, chemical engineers, geophysicists, a whole host of people. And that's kind of been true throughout my career and at every stage, is just constantly pushing myself to try and learn more.
Yeah, wonderful. So before we talk about recession and recessions and unintuitive things you've learned about recessions, or what are some of the practical implications we should know about, would love to hear a bit about your journey as an author and your motivation, for this to come about and for you to write this one.
What's been interesting about this book project has been that it was my first book with a trade press. So my prior 3 books were all published with university presses, so for much more of a niche academic audience. Whereas with this project, this was intended, even though it's a very academic book in some regards in terms of there are lots of data appendices and lots of footnotes and a lot of research and statistical analysis that went into it, but it was also written to hopefully appeal to a broader audience. The genesis of the project was actually in 2021, and when I began the project, the hypothesis that I had in mind was that the 2020 pandemic recession was unique, that unlike previous recessions, there was nothing wrong with the US or British economy on the eve of that recession, for which recession was some sort of cleansing. When I thought of 2008 or 2001, I thought, oh, well, there were issues with those economic expansions that then led to the subsequent recessions. But the more I got into the research, the more I realized that to a large extent, 2020 wasn't so unique. I mean, obviously not all recessions, most recessions aren't about a pandemic, but the more I realized that actually there's nothing wrong in an economic expansion to which recession constitutes the inevitable, some might even say necessary remedy. Rather, recessions are fundamentally about shocks.
So fascinating. As we're reaching out to the broader audience, I'd love to start with just the basic, right? How do you define a recession? Or what are some of the macroeconomic indicators that people use to maybe predict recessions?
So the definition I use in the book is the same as that used by the National Bureau of Economic Research, which is that a recession is a significant decline in economic activity that spread across the economy, across many sectors, and lasts for more than a few months. And that combination of depth, diffusion, and duration allows one to sort of flexibly define a recession rather than adhering to a very strict rule of thumb like a recession is 2 quarters of contraction in gross domestic product. And you also need to do that if you're trying to study, as I do in the book, recessions across many centuries, because if you go back to the 18th or 19th century, you just don't have data available at quarterly or monthly frequency. A defining feature of recessions is really the substitution of a sudden, sharp upward movement in the unemployment rate for a more gradual downward or sideways movement. So the late U.S. Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart, when describing the task of defining pornography, he said, well, I can't perhaps satisfactorily define it, but I know it when I see it. And similarly with recessions, in addition to the definition I just gave, I would also say you kind of know it when you see it.
Yeah, and you feel it.
And you feel it.
Yeah, yeah. And so one of the indicators, sounds like, is the rise in unemployment. Any other major macroeconomic indicators?
Say the other indicator related to the unemployment rate is a decline in employment. Mm-hmm. So the fundamental feature of the vast majority of recessions is you have net job losses. And that's why, to your earlier point, you feel it. Maybe not everyone feels it, but a lot of people do.
Interesting. And Tyler, you've now studied, like you mentioned, centuries of recession. So not just the pandemic, but the 2008, the internet bubble and burst, all the way going back to the 1700s. As you've studied so many recessions in different geographies globally and so on, what are some of the unintuitive things you've noticed and you've learned about recession?
One is that despite lots of institutional changes over the past 4 centuries, despite the rise of a more interventionist state with a bigger economic footprint, the depth and duration of recessions has been remarkably constant across time and space. So recessions have gotten rarer, but they haven't gotten shorter or shallower. I would say the second big finding and somewhat non-intuitive is that recessions are not about boom and bust. We tell these stories about economic recessions is that there was some boom, there was some excess, there was some malinvestment to which recession was the inevitable, even necessary cleansing remedy. But the reality is there is simply no information in the height, the speed, the duration, or the composition of an economic expansion that can explain anything in terms of the probability, the depth, the speed, the duration, or composition of the subsequent recession. Economic expansions don't die of old age or infirmity. In the words of former Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke, they're murdered. And so that's why I say recessions are not about some bus inevitably following a boom. They're about adverse shocks that we could neither fully anticipate nor effectively hedge against.
And on average, what's like a duration of recession?
The majority of recessions are over in about 12 months, the vast majority in fewer than 24. Of those few exceptions that have exceeded 2 years, so 3 or 4 years, the vast majority were associated with world war or war that really visited one's soil in a major way. So for example, in the 18th century in the United States, we had a depression magnitude recession during the American Revolutionary War.
Of course, it's still an unfortunate event, and there's a lot of suffering as the economy goes into recession. Would you say they're fairly short-lived in some ways?
Historically, they have been relatively short-lived, and over 80% of the time, the economy is expanding. And what's interesting is that the United Kingdom, historically, over the past 2 centuries, has consistently been much less recession-prone than the United States, and yet the United Kingdom is today and has long been at least 30% poorer per person than the United States. And I think that's a reminder that while we worry a lot about recessions because they hurt a lot of people, we probably ought to be at least as concerned about economic expansions, because at the end of the day, the majority of years in which economies expand matter more for long-term prosperity and indeed human flourishing than the minority of years in which they contract.
Sure, interesting. Even in the process of creativity, right, destruction is actually necessary to create something new and get to the next level. So does it mean that recessions are almost actually a necessary evil for a step function in economic growth?
So this was the thesis of the late, great Harvard economist Joseph Schumpeter. He coined the term creative destruction, that sometimes you need these gales of creative destruction where a lot of firms fail so that you can unlock workers and capital, and those workers and that capital can migrate from less efficient to more efficient enterprises. And I interrogate this thesis in the book. That process is on net impaired rather than enhanced by economic recessions. There's a lot of destruction during recessions, but there's not as much creation. And on net, recessions are rampant age discriminators. They discriminate against younger workers. They discriminate against younger, often more dynamic firms. And also, they collapse this whole ladder by which workers move from less productive to more productive enterprises. Because one of the salient features of economic expansions is you constantly have this churn of people quitting less productive firms. They're quitting jobs in which they just don't have a very good match with their employer, and they're moving to better quality matches. And during recessions, quitting collapses because people don't dare to leave their job, and hiring collapses because a lot of firms don't dare to take on new workers. So on net, even though creative destruction is important for longer-term growth, it's impaired rather than enhanced by recessions.
Fascinating.
And typically, a few years on from a recession, the composition of the economy looks pretty darn similar to how it would have looked had it continued uninterrupted along trend.
Even with the Industrial Revolution, now we're seeing with AI, people doing a certain job which is maybe not as efficient, or technology can automate it, do it much more efficiently, going from there towards somewhere where it's innately human, where we need to be more creative. That motion is the motion that expands economies and expands GDPs and adds a lot of value. And the point you're making is that recessions actually impede that movement. And in some ways, it's a practical implication, because I see a lot of people being anxious, even among my friends. Hey, do we stay in the market? Do we get out of the market? We're obsessing about predicting recessions. But the other thing I found fascinating about your book was the plucking model. The deeper the recession, the higher the recovery. Could you speak a bit more to that?
Sure. And first of all, like many, I'm also constantly trying to anticipate or foresee recessions. But one of the conclusions of the book is that recessions are fundamentally unforecastable. Mm-hmm. If you knew that there was going to be a recession tomorrow, then as a depositor, you would withdraw your deposits today. As a consumer, you would probably spend less and save more today. As a business, you would probably invest less and hire less today, and you would get the recession today rather than tomorrow. And this unpredictability, I think, actually leads to the plucking model, because they're basically two analytical frameworks, models with which to think about economic fluctuations. So one is this sort of oscillationist view that you have a trend in the economy, and in actuality you fluctuate or oscillate around that trend. And there's another model which was pioneered by Milton Friedman, which is that economic fluctuations really aren't about oscillations, about the economy is growing too fast, above potential, and therefore you need to get this subsequent correction or corrective contraction. In the plucking model, you have an economy that's growing pretty much in line with its long-term potential trend growth rate, and then you get some adverse shock, and the economy temporarily deviates from that trend, and then when the shock dissipates, then you rebound back to trend. And so in that plucking model, you would expect to observe that the depth and speed of a contraction is completely unrelated to the height and speed of the preceding expansion, but that, as you noted, the speed and height of the rebound should be very much proportional to the speed and the depth of the preceding contraction. And indeed, that is the pattern that I find looking at almost 4 centuries of data in both the United States and the United Kingdom.
So not only are they short-lived, but if they're faster and deeper, then they're going to be as fast to recover and will hit the top, the top.
It'll be a bigger rebound.
A bigger rebound.
Yes.
Very interesting. And I think you make a point in the book or otherwise that, recessions make for good stories, right? And that's part of the reason why people talk so much about it. Do you want to speak a bit more to that?
Sure. I mean, recessions and the stories we tell about ourselves about recessions, they have all the classic ingredients of a good story. They often have setting, often the city of London or Wall Street. They have plot. They have characters, protagonists, antagonists. Ben Bernanke described himself as a firefighter. And then you also have antagonists, often greedy bankers. You have conflict and you have resolution. After all, every recession has ultimately ended in renewed economic expansion. And crucially, you have theme, some moral lesson by which we might hope to live better and freer from harm and freer from guilt. We are, at the end of the day, pattern-seeking mammals. When we experience the trauma of recessions, we look for some precipitate action or misdeed or actions that preceded or were proximate to that recession so that we might endeavor to correct them in the future. But the reality is recessions are random events. They're caused by shocks, and therefore we probably ought to exercise some caution not to medicate or otherwise sedate economic expansions that fundamentally die healthy and innocent.
Given what you've learned about recession, what's your practical advice to a common person in terms of, financial management?
And I'm not the first to make this point on the expansion side, but economic expansions don't die of old age. There's nothing in the age of an economic expansion that can tell you about the predictability, the probability that it's about to end in recession. Though recessions are unpredictable, unforecastable, expansions are predictable. And one of the strongest predictors of the birth of an economic expansion is the age of the recession, because recessions do die of old age and always have. So with each subsequent quarter or month of recession, the probability of renewed economic expansion goes up. In terms of practical advice for investors, and particularly your median, typical investors who's not a professional investor, and I should disclose upfront, I am not a certified financial advisor. I would say that a lot of what I find in the book would recommend some pretty standard bread and butter investment advice. Namely, these things are not predictable, so don't be trying to time the market if you're not a professional investor. And secondly, since they are typically over within a couple of years or fewer, just try to maintain a broadly diversified portfolio that's tailored to your risk appetite and tailored to your age profile. And that's pretty standard, long-standing investment advice. For a lot of people, they may involve job loss or income loss. And that's why I think another common piece of advice is it's typically good to maintain 6 to 12 months of liquid reserves just so that you can meet expenditures in the event of income or worse employment loss.
In one of our previous conversations, one thing I found fascinating, what you mentioned about the 2008 recession and crisis, and we'll talk more about these external shocks. But if you can review and present your analysis of what happened in 2008 as it relates to an external shock and that recession, that would be awesome.
Yeah, so the conventional narrative of 2008 goes something like this, that there are people who allegedly should never have been able to buy a home because they couldn't afford it. They were egged on by reckless mortgage originators who were in turn egged on by greedy bankers, and all of this was overseen by regulators who were asleep at the wheel and could have and should have seen this coming. I challenged that narrative, in part by pointing out that, if anything, housing markets in the 2000s were telling us that actually the United States needed more housing because the cost of buying a home as a multiple of median household income has never been higher than it's been in the past 5 years. In fact, I think it peaked in 2022. So if anything, markets were saying, actually, we need more housing. And try telling a millennial or Gen Z person today who's trying to get on the housing ladder that the problem in the 2000s was we built too many houses. So if I asked you to name when the price of energy in the past century reached its all-time high, you might guess 1973 during the Arab oil embargo, or 1979-80 during the Iranian Revolution, or 1990 during the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. But the correct answer would actually be June 2008.
Wow. The
inflation-adjusted price of a barrel of oil or energy overall was never more expensive in the past century than in June 2008 as a result of a confluence of shocks to both energy supply and energy demand. As a result of that, by summer 2008, the average American household was having to spend a record $8,500 per year on energy goods and services. That was $2,000 more than they'd have been having to spend just a few years prior. And as energy drove up the cost of food, food inflation topped 6%. And also, in part because of energy inflation, that raised inflation and inflation expectations, which pushed up interest rates. And so the average American household was having to spend about $800 more per year on mortgage interest payments as their adjustable mortgages reset higher. Roughly half of American households typically have no savings after taxes. And food and energy are not really easy expenditures on which to economize. You got to commute to work, you got to drop your kids off at school, you got to put food on the table, you have to heat and cool your home. And so by summer 2008, something had to give. And what gave was that about 5% of American homeowners fell seriously behind on their mortgage interest payments. And the rest, as they say, is history.
Very interesting. So that's a great kind of pivot to one of the hottest topics these days, which is AI and the bubble that we're in. How are bubbles defined, and what are some of the macroeconomic indicators to say that, oh, maybe we are in a bubble?
So I have yet to find a satisfactory definition of a bubble. And there are a lot of folks who ex post say, oh, that was clearly a bubble. But the reality is, if you look at real physical infrastructure, whether that's canals in the 18th and 19th centuries, or railroads in the 19th and early 20th centuries, or fiber optic cables in the 1990s and 2000s, or you can zoom out more broadly to look at residential real estate, the housing stock, the physical stock of housing in the economy, or the physical stock of commercial real estate in the economy. There's simply no instance of a contraction in that stock from a peak to which the economy did not subsequently return. I mean, there is remarkable fidelity to long-run trend. And when you think about some of these past transformational technologies like canals, like railroads, like fiber optic cables, that long-run trend resembles a remarkably smooth technology S-curve, adoption curve. And so I like to make the distinction between asset valuations and predictions about the direction of asset prices, because one might correctly call a peak, at least a local peak, and bundle that with a prediction that therefore there will be a recession. One might be correct in the former prediction, but more often than not, they're going to be wrong on the second prediction, because a lot of these peaks are the casualty of recessionary shocks elsewhere in the economy rather than a cause thereof. And 2001 is a prime example. So the conventional story of the 2001 recession is that that was the dot-com recession. I argue in the book that the decline in tech stock prices, which had actually already started to reverse by the start of the recession, that was just one of at least 4 shocks impacting the U.S. economy, and quantitatively it was the least important shock. There was also a big run-up in energy prices, particularly natural gas prices, a casualty of which was Enron, because there were rolling blackouts across the state of California. There was also the establishment of permanent most favored nation status with the People's Republic of China, an immediate consequence of which was a sharp decline in net new hiring in U.S. manufacturing and industry. And then the most important shock to impact the U.S. economy in 2001 was the terrorist attacks of September 11th. And in fact, all of the output decline during that relatively short, relatively mild recession occurred during the quarter that included the complete closure of U.S. airspace, widespread fear by consumers and businesses, and economic activity really grinding to a halt in the economic center of what was then the second largest economy in the U.S., namely New York.
Very interesting. Of course, internet as we know it was, it's changed the world we live in. But very much when we talk about 2001, we talk about, the internet boom and then bust. Without a doubt, that was a huge technological revolution that has made even AI possible. One way of looking at the situation is there was this technological revolution and it was, things were going up and it was adding a lot of value. But then there were these 4 important shocks to the system all happening around the same time, which kind of pulled the economy into recession. And one of the implications was, there was a kind of a bust, or technology stock prices went all time low, and a lot of people had to file for bankruptcy. Is that right?
I would say that's broadly correct. And yes, the decline in tech stock prices in 2000 and 2001 need not have caused a recession. And I argue that without 9/11, there wouldn't have been a recession in 2001. Because we have estimates, empirical estimates of the responsiveness of consumer spending to changes in financial wealth. And those estimates simply cannot explain the magnitude of the decline in consumer spending during the third quarter of 2001, especially when one considers that tech stock ownership was very highly skewed toward the upper end of the income and net worth distributions, and those folks tend to be less responsive in their expenditure behavior, tend to be less responsive to changes in financial wealth.
Wow, fascinating. Very interesting. Talking about bubbles and recessions, like AI bubble being created, what are your thoughts on that?
This is where I go back to those technology adoption S-curves, because one thing I do in the book is I interrogate the thesis that speculative manias, bubbles in canals and railroads were serial killers of economic expansions on both sides of the Atlantic in the 18th and 19th centuries. If this were about speculative manias and bubbles, then you would expect sharp increases followed by plateaus or maybe even declines, followed by sharp increases, followed by plateaus or declines. But instead, you just see this very smooth S-curve. And similarly with fiber optic cables or the cumulative number of connected households in the late 1990s, early 2000s, there were a lot of folks saying this pace cannot continue. And at that point, we were only adding, a few miles a year of fiber optic cables. And yet, there again, remarkable fidelity to the long-run trends in terms of the real physical infrastructure. So I don't presume to be able to predict the direction of asset prices or whether valuations are stretched, and if so, by how much. What I would say is that on the basis of 4 centuries of economic history, I would expect that whatever's going on with a lot of valuations, securities valuations, trends in the real physical infrastructure are going to be pretty persistent and pretty faithful to those trends.
Mm-hmm. The past is not a predictor of the future, but I would love for you to tell us about the studying the recession of the 1770s, and if there are any parallels of external shocks that are being created. Specifically talking about Strait of Hormuz or any other external shocks that you feel are being created that could, in fact, pull the economy into a recession.
The 4 longest recessions in U.S. history were the Great Depression, which was a confluence of many shocks, including a locust plague of really providential proportions that devastated the American plains and Midwest. That was really the only pure peacetime 4-year recession, in 3 or 4 year recession in U.S. history. The other candidates all involved major war. So in the 1770s, there was the American Revolution, which was really a depression magnitude recession. You also had a very protracted recession in the new United States during the Articles of Confederation period, which was a period of a lot of economic and financial chaos. You had an armed insurrection. You had just a lot of adverse shocks going on. But then you can go even farther back in time, and one finds evidence of really a depression magnitude recession from about 1717 to 1720, tied for one of the longest recessions in U.S. history. And you just have a complete collapse in trade for the American colonies and a big contraction of the money supply. So when I went back to consult the qualitative contemporary sources, what I found was that the cause of that recession, unambiguously, were pirates.
Wow.
So this was the golden age, so-called golden age of North Atlantic and Atlantic piracy, because you had the end of the War of the Spanish Succession, during which the British government had paid sailors to engage in privateering on Spanish galleons. And after the war's end, you have therefore all these unemployed sailors. So they started predating on American and Atlantic commerce, and all of the classic names in piracy, including Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard. You had Calico Jack, all these classics, and they were blockading the port of Charleston, a very important port. They were intercepting commerce between the Caribbean and Salem, Massachusetts, often intercepting ships off Long Island. They were even sailing up and predating on commercial shipping in the Chesapeake Bay and as far north as Newfoundland. And I thought that this was an interesting story. I thought it was a little bit anachronistic. I didn't see that it was particularly relevant to today. But maybe the story is not so much about pirates, but about the importance of key shipping lanes and key commercial choke points. And so it's interesting to reflect on that recession in the context of Tehran having recently closed the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah, fascinating, and a lot of parallels there, because in the end it throws the global supply chain and trade. It's actually impacting the very common man in India, the closure of Strait of Hormuz. I was talking to my friends in India, and people who are even getting their homes renovated. Actually, paint prices and some of the very basic things are like off the charts right now. Chemical industry, right? A huge shock to the chemical industry, and these things can act as feedstock for producing other things, right? So people are starting to look at other choke points in the world. Strait of Hormuz could very well be that external shock. So one would love your commentary on that, but do you see any other unintuitive external shocks that could pull the economy into recession?
So first of all, I should say that having just written a book about recessions in which I conclude that recessions are fundamentally unforecastable. I shouldn't get into the business of trying to predict them. However, what I can say is that even though every recession is different, I mean, I liken it to the Anna Karenina principle. So the opening line of Leo Tolstoy's Anna Karenina is that happy families are all alike, whereas every unhappy family is unhappy in their own way. And economic fluctuations are kind of similar because expansions are about gradual yet inexorable recovery from prior shocks, whereas every recession constitutes an economic expansion that was terminated in its own way. That said, there are two broad categories of shocks. One is macro in nature. So think of a pandemic that affects all sectors of the economy roughly contemporaneously and roughly equally. But then you have another class or category of shocks which are much more microeconomic in nature. So maybe they only directly affect one or two sectors, but those sectors are very highly linked to the rest of the economy. And over, say, a 6 to 12 month time horizon, which, as I said, is the duration of a majority of recessions, it's just very difficult for households and businesses to find substitutes. So that's one reason why historically energy supply shocks were frequent contributors to recessions on both sides of the Atlantic. Before the post-war oil recessions in the United States, there was industrial action in coal, and before that, adverse harvest events would disrupt the supply of animal feed, which is important back then for transportation, and also for peat or turf, which was combusted for residential heating and industrial power generation even. So in any given year over the past century for the United States, there's been about a 1 in 10 chance of an energy-related recession that has been declining over time. But another one might be the 17 elements on your periodic table, the export restrictions on which were threatened last year by Beijing. That kind of shock would be, if that were to come to pass, it would be more in keeping with a lot of the types of recessionary shocks we've seen in the past in terms of supply and availability of critical inputs.
Very interesting. Very interesting. So you mentioned one of the macroeconomic factors is the increase in unemployment. So one, we have the economic growth coming from AI and technology and so on, but then this growth is causing potentially causing unemployment, which is kind of a force that's pulling everything backwards. I would love to get your thoughts on these two sides of the coin almost.
I would say that on the basis of history, it's rare to observe a positive technology shock as causing a recession now. And partly that goes back to that characterization I made earlier of recessions as a sudden, sharp upward movement in unemployment. Whereas even with relatively fast-moving technological adoption, they're still more gradual.
Yeah.
And so over the long run, I would expect that, like with previous productivity-enhancing technological changes, I would expect AI to ultimately be complementary to humans in the production process. Because at the end of the day, automating human tasks is something that we've been doing for a very long time. This is likely to automate a whole new category of human tasks, namely cognitive. But over time, we do learn how to use capital and energy and other inputs in production. Now, that said, there are transition risks in terms of maybe it doesn't cause a recession, but there is going to be income and employment loss. And I think that's why it's potentially helpful that we do have infrastructure in place today, and maybe that needs to be enhanced to replace income where it's lost. We have that through the unemployment insurance system, and also to assist with reskilling in the event of employment loss.
The key point here is that the rise in unemployment needs to be kind of steep. But here with AI, and actually, truly speaking, adoption of AI at the enterprise is still fairly low. I talked to a lot of Fortune 500 executives. Of course, we're now using Copilot to maybe write better emails. But when it comes to real adoption or real fundamental change in how companies function, we're yet to get there. So to your point, even if it causes a bit of unemployment, it's much slower than what we might expect. So Tyler, one question I have is around the energy mix. Of course, traditionally oil and gas being one of the main source of energy, but there's a lot of talk about solar and wind, and there's a lot of talk around geothermal, a lot of talk around nuclear, making it back, investment going into making nuclear fusion a reality. So many different forms of energy on the table, along with the talk around decarbonization. As the demand for more energy and power that just continues to increase, not just because of AI, because of economic prosperity, more people having a better standard of living, how does that energy mix change as we look out into the future?
Right, so you intimated this. There is no such thing as a high-income, low-energy economy. So the two very much go hand in hand. And one of the things that one appreciates when one zooms out to the long term, as I've done in the book, is the scale of the global energy system and therefore how slow-moving it is. And so you think about all the events and developments that have happened over just the past couple of decades, from geopolitics to economic to policy to technology, and yet the global energy mix has been remarkably stable at long-run trends. So the composition is changing, but the trend rates of change are remarkably persistent. And so I think if one looks ahead in the coming decades, then we would probably expect to continue to observe wind and solar growing very fast and probably growing the fastest, mostly at the expense of coal. And as a share of the global energy mix, you're probably looking at oil and gas declining a little bit from today's 56%, but still remaining an important part of the energy mix just because a lot of different processes, such as industrial, they require a lot of heat that electrification simply can't yet generate. And also when you're looking at things like aviation, maritime transportation, commercial trucking, and just long-haul travel, that we don't yet have the energy density and batteries to fully do that. So I think there's going to be just a lot of trend stationarity and probably some more persistence in some things than folks are currently anticipating.
Very interesting. Although the need for power energy will expand, and so that expansion will come from these alternate sources of energy. But as we zoom out and look at kind of the energy mix, it'll probably remain pretty stable or constant. Yeah.
Probably in absolute terms, you're looking at continued growth in oil demand through the early 2030s, followed by a plateau rather than a decline or peak. And also continued growth in natural gas demand, just because it's a flexible fuel, it's relatively clean, and so that's why I think those are the reasons why I think you're going to see continued trend stationarity in that global energy mix.
I mean, one of the things, I don't know if you have thoughts on, I'm spending a lot of time on these data center build-outs, and the parking lots in data centers are actually as big as the data centers from 5 years ago. So just the scale of data centers is enormous, and they're extremely power hungry. A couple of big bottlenecks, of course, are gas turbines and transformers. A lot of long lead items there, but a lot of conversation about the grid going behind the meter, having sources of power that are behind the meter. What could be the solution, right? And people are starting to already talk about data centers in space, where some of these bottlenecks can be solved more easily.
Great question. So one of the things one finds when studying 4 centuries of economic history, and it's a bit of a truism, but it's worth remembering, is that the pace of any technological change is ultimately limited not by that in which we are most efficient or least constrained, but rather by that in which we are least efficient or most constrained. And so there are concerns about, as we were discussing earlier, will AI create higher unemployment during its adoption phase? The pace is going to be limited by some of these bottlenecks. There are permitting issues, there are potentially turbine issues, that sort of thing. So pace of change is moderated by the activities or the inputs in which we are most constrained.
Awesome, Tyler. Really enjoyed the conversation. Are you ready for some rapid fire?
Sure.
What's the biggest economic shift that you believe AI will create in the next 5 years?
Investment, capital expenditure. The biggest change will be increased capital expenditure, and that's sort of what we've already been observing.
Got it. What's one economic idea that most people misunderstand?
David Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage.
To
The
that?
idea that two countries should specialize in production of the good or service in which they have the lowest relative opportunity cost of producing, even if one country has an absolute advantage in production of all goods and services.
Wow. If there's one prediction you could make for the next 10 years, we've talked about many different topics. What would that be?
I would say that insofar as economies exhibit a lot of trend stationarity, then I would expect the U.S. economy to be substantially larger in 10 years and for average incomes to be higher.
Yeah. What's one of the biggest risks that AI introduces for economic stability, if any?
In the near term, one of the challenges is that if you have a technological change that's going to raise future output and raise future incomes, then it has an investment effect today because you need to build the infrastructure to enable those productivity, that increased output. That can put upward pressure on interest rates. And also, insofar as rational, forward-looking consumers are looking ahead to higher incomes, they may pull forward some spending because they're anticipating higher income in the future. So that can also put some upward pressure on interest rates and inflation.
Very interesting. What are some of the things we've learned from previous financial crises that are still being ignored?
So one of the things that the United Kingdom historically did really well during moments of financial stress was to, first of all, adhere to some form of Bagehot's rule, which is basically that the lender of last resort, the central bank, should lend liberally and early against good collateral and at a penalty rate, and also to facilitate or coordinate the absorption of weaker banks by stronger, healthier banks. That was something that the British banking system and the Bank of England historically did very well, and the United States historically not so well.
Of course, we spoke about how UK's recovery has actually been, much slower than the recovery of United States, partly because of the banking system. Yeah.
And the regulatory response to 2008 to regulate banks and to basically mandate that they lend more to the public sector instead of the private sector. And that had a much bigger impact in the United Kingdom because A, they were historically, and particularly British businesses, were historically more reliant on banks for external finances.
Yeah.
And B, the United Kingdom had fewer banks that were on average larger and therefore were more likely to be treated by the new regulatory regime in the aftermath of 2008, 2009.
Wow, so interesting. Well, awesome, Tyler. This was such a great conversation. I learned a lot about recessions, macroeconomics, AI, the bubble potentially that's being created, how to think about recessions, some of the key practical implications, and I very much enjoyed it, learned a lot.
Likewise. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks, Tyler.
Cheers.
Yeah.